Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. This morning we talk about the future of democracy. And we have 4 speakers, so we have a very tight program. This is why we start right now. And we start with our first speaker, who is Wolfgang Merkel. Wolfgang Merkel is a member of the NCCR Democracy, where he directs a very important project, the Democracy Barometer, which tries to measure the quality of democracy. Wolfgang Merkel has studied political science, history, sports, and international relations in Heidelberg and Bologna, and he has done research and taught at different universities: Bielefeld, Mainz, Harvard, Madrid, and Heidelberg. And currently he's a professor at Humboldt University in Berlin, and he's the head of a research unit at the Social Science Center in Berlin, a research unit which deals precisely with the question of democracy. And today he will talk about democracy in decline, ? Wolfgang, the floor is yours.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad to share some of my thoughts on the question, one could even say the eternal question: is democracy in crisis? Diagnoses on the crisis of democracy are as old as democracy itself. As a leitmotif, they span through the philosophical and political thinking of the Western world. They accompanied the emergence of the city democracies in Athens, inspired the social and political thoughts of representative democracy in the 19th century, of liberals and socialists, and they deliver in the 21st century something like a melancholic background tune for democracy in an era of globalization. The critique of democracy and the diagnosis on its crisis are associated with the foremost names in European philosophy: Plato, Aristotle, Hobbes, Tocqueville, Marx, and Max Weber. However, it is especially the 1970s when the topic of crisis of democracy emerged in politics and political science, and you will find on the left and the right wing famous political scientists or philosophers like Jürgen Habermas, Klaus Offe, but also Samuel Huntington, just to name a few. Only recently, a small book was released under the title Post-Democracy. Its author, Colin Crouch, argues that the democratic moment, which still burgeoned in the United States prior to the Second World War and in Western Europe immediately after the war, has now come to an end. The developed world is instead approaching the stadium of post-democracy, and this post-democracy displays many features of an era of pre-democracy. Is this true? Is democracy caught up in a crisis? Are we indeed underway to a post-democratic era? The following questions are to mark a kind of cognitive map which should lead me, and therefore you as well, through my presentation. What do we mean if we talk about democracy? What do we actually mean if we talk about crisis? Which norms, institutions, procedures, and results of democracies are caught in crisis? And finally, is democracy at risk? The minimalist point of departure, if we are talking about democracy, maintains that free and fair election with a secret ballot form not only the core of democracy, but make up the very phenomenon itself. Alois Schumpeter and most of the American scholars on democracy are very much following this line of a kind of elitist electoral concept of democracy. There are proponents of a middle-range concept of democracy which add to this undisputed core of free and fair election with equal and secret suffrage, the fears of the rule of law and horizontal accountability. They argue only by embedding free elections in a framework guaranteeing fundamental human rights and civil liberties and control of the executive, the legislative, and judicial powers are formally democratic elections also rendered them democratically meaningful. Jürgen Habermas has called this the normatively and empirically indispensable co-originality of civil liberties and political rights. Moreover, political participation is not to be understood in a minimalist vein as a mere act of voting. Additional forms of participation, such as referenda, civil society activity, and public discourse, are to hinder the political parties from monopolizing the right to articulate societal interests. Only then can a strong democracy grow out of a thin one. For maximalists, this is not enough. They incorporate in their concept of democracy the output dimension in their concept. This entails public goods such as security, economic welfare, and a social welfare state which guarantees the fairness in the distribution of life chances. Only an institutionalized social democracy can secure political equality as one core principle of democracy. This point of view was advocated by Hermann Heller, a well-known constitutionalist in the Weimar Republic. As you will see immediately in the following, I will embark very much on this middle-range concept of democracy, will not follow this maximalist line, but also not following the steps of Schumpeter, and as I have said, most of the empirical research on democracy which you find in the Anglo-Saxon world. What is a crisis? The ubiquitous use of the word crisis has worn out the semantic core of the concept. At the most general level, a crisis can be understood as a situation which marks either the high or the turning point of a perilous development. In medical terms, it is a question of life and death. When used in its more narrow sense on a democratic political order, the term crisis implies a serious systemic disruption of democracy that endanger its institutional core. Democracy rests especially on two sources of legitimacy. As David Easton has put it, it is the specific and the diffuse support of citizens. Specific support, as you know, concentrates in a very utilitarian fashion on the performance of democracy, on its effectiveness to produce the goods the citizens expect. Diffuse support pertains to the fairness of the norms, institutions, and procedures of democracy itself. If one of these two sources runs the risk of trying out, this can, in the medium term, be compensated by an additional legitimacy influx from the remaining source. In the long run, however, so goes my argument, all democracies need an adequate level of citizen support in both dimensions. If, for example, specific outcomes such as internal and external security are no longer warranted for, or if grave disturbances shake the economic sphere and leading to strongly reduced welfare and mass unemployment, then democratic institutions and procedures will hardly be able to secure the existence of democracy in the long term. If a system does not display an acceptable output performance, but the democratic procedures are disregarded, we are normally no longer dealing with a liberal democracy. Singapore is an example of this. Which challenges does democracy face at present? An integral part of the crisis diagnosis is a claim that the core functions of democracy, such as participation, representation, and inclusion, are hollowing out. Participation is decreasing, representation is breaking, and inclusion is failing. Democracy is losing its participatory core and is degenerating into an elitist onlooker democracy. Again, is this true? Let us look to the challenge of participation first. In Western and Eastern Europe, voter turnout is declining. The members are abandoning the parties, leaving behind a citizenry retreating to the private sphere. As a matter of fact, the election turnout in Western democracies has declined from nearly 78% down to 73. I hope I press the right button now. Okay, you see here the blue line which shows the electoral turnout in Western democracy. During the last 2 decades, it's not really dramatic. It is visible, but not dramatic. But if you see the red line, which displays the electoral turnout in the new and young democracies in Eastern Europe, then there is a quite significant decline, which make dubious whether you still have properly working democracies. I would argue they are consolidated to some extent. However, the decline of the participatory level is something threatening. And if you would look, for example, to European elections, then you would find a voting turnout, for example, in the lowest case in Poland, of not more than 16%. You can think about how much legitimacy 16% of the electorate can produce. But thus, the question immediately has to be posed. Does the level of voter turnout actually say anything about the quality of democracy. Is 80% better than 70? 70 better than 60%? The higher the voter turnout, the better? Are maximum and optimum identical? This is indeed, as you know, a contested claim both in the field of democratic theory and empirical research. Here again, especially Anglo-Saxon democracy scholars even warn against excessive participation and overheating of democracy when voter turnout rises too much, consequently turning what they call critical elections. Such a mobilization is thought to signalize not a strong support for political parties and democracy, but rather discontent and polarization. One does not necessarily follow this judgment a la Josef Schumpeter. As a matter of fact, the level of, and this is quite an interesting argument or an empirical fact, the level of satisfaction with democracy among EU citizens as measured by surveys does not correlate at all with the level of voter turnout. The correlation coefficient for 44 evaluated elections in the EU between 1989 and 2001 was completely insignificant, 0.02. And also interesting, over the past 2 decades, Switzerland, with on the average 45% of voter turnout, and the US in congressional election not more than 33%, have displayed the lowest rates of voter turnout in the OECD, yet in both countries, the citizens' subjective satisfaction with democracy lies well above the OECD average. So the subjective perception of the citizens is something quite different from the level of electoral participation. What matters more, I would also argue, than the actual rate of voter turnout are instances where turnout is contingent upon belonging to a certain social class, an ethnic or religious minority, or upon one's gender or level of education. In these cases, there is reason to believe that social inequality erodes the democratic core principle of political equality. The social selectivity in voter turnout is apropos less prominent in Germany than it is in Switzerland or in the US. Let me show, and I was even thinking about whether I should display this graph, because it shows something which is very sensitive in these days to show as a German in Switzerland. And this comes out of our research of the democracy barometer of the NCCR and the Wissenschaftszentrum in Berlin. You see here, the average is a blue line. You see here the average, and there is, during this period of 10 years, and now we have figures from 1990 to 2010, there is no decline at all. And then you see this is the best performer. This is Denmark, of the 30th most mature and best performing democracies on the globe. And here you have Italy, and here you have a kind of Berlusconi effect going down. You can visibly see it. This is a very aggregate figure, and behind this line are 90 indicators. We were looking to 90 indicators in order to find out something about the quality of democracy. And now comes the sensitive point to put here, and it's not a German conspiracy, and we were astonished as well. Switzerland is slightly behind Germany. So we calculated this again and again, and one part of our group, or even the major part, is coming from Switzerland, and so again it is something what we found out, and I think it would be a quite provoking article in the Neue Zürcher Zeitung titling with the title, "Is German Democracy Better Than Swiss Democracy?" If this falls in an era of Steinbrück, or follows, so to say, what our Minister of Finance says, it probably would provoke some discussion. And one reason for it, by the way, is certainly not the only one, and the margin is quite slim, and both countries are slightly above the average of the 30 countries, is that the social selectivity, especially social selectivity based on education and class, is visibly higher in Switzerland than in many of the other democracies in Western Europe. I will come back to this point as well. Let me add something. I was talking here about the conventional participation, political participation, especially on electoral participation. Now, of course, and in Switzerland again, we know this is not the only instrument through which citizens can express their preferences. There are referenda, and there's another thing which became a kind of panacea of all the problems democracy has. This is called civil society. And there is one problematic thing as well. Seen from a democratic perspective, one could even talk about the dark side of civil society. As nice and as good and enriching the participation of Amnesty International, Transparency International, ATTAC, and other of these civic organizations may be, they are even much higher socially selective than electoral participation. Civil society is very much class-based. It is a middle-class thing. So if democracy is based on the core principle of political participation, and if parties and elections lose grip on the core of representation and they get complemented by civil society, this may be a good thing. However, it will exacerbate the social selectivity of our societies. I will come to another point as well, which I think has not, or the debate only began. What we see here is, during the last 50 years, a robust and steady continuing decline of the catch-all parties, Volksparteien. So there seems to be an irreversible decline. Volksparteien, which are by definition and even by historical facts, had been the main political integration machines of our society, of our societies, at least in Western Europe. They are declining. The question is if catch-all parties are substituted more and more by smaller clientelist parties, populist parties, single-issue parties. This will have a major impact on the inclusion, coherence, cohesion of our society. Since in my being as a member of the civic society. I'm sitting in a Grundwerte-Kommission, Basic Value Commission of the SPD. They even refuse to have such a discussion. Now I forced them with this table to open this discussion. And this is not only something of the left, more left-oriented mass parties. This is something which Christian democratic parties are facing at this point as well. Let me come to the next point. The next point, and this is something we know from many surveys and opinion polls. If the citizens are asked which of the political organization and institutions they support most, the two organizations or institutions which are the institutions par excellence for representative democracy, namely political parties and parliaments, always get the lowest score. Institutions like the church, the military, the police are performing much more better. They have the support in Western democracies of the citizens. But one has to look somewhat closer to these surveys, and there is an interesting fact one has to discuss as well. The fact is, if you ask the citizen, do you support political parties, or what do you think about political parties, you get very low score. If you modify this question, and if you ask the citizens, what do you think about your party? Do you trust your party? You get quite different results, much more positive. This is also something we should discuss and should not take all the surveys at face value. But it's clear there is a distrust. There's a distrust from the citizens towards the political elites. The media likes to call them political class, something from a sociological point of view does not really hold. The causes. What are the causes, or some of the causes for this decline of trust? The main cause for it is that there is a gap between the increased citizen demand on political outcomes, especially in the economic sphere and in the social sphere on the one side, and the offer from the supply side, meaning from the politicians. The more successfully politics delivers, that is, the more successfully it can master the integration of multi-ethnic societies, the more successfully it prevents the divergence between the rich and the poor, and the more reliably it guarantees internal security for the citizens, the less will society be characterized by mutual distrust. This is something which we have at the service by all the social capital research. So this is something indeed different from the 1950s and 60s, the increased distrust towards the politician. But I immediately will argue, and there are many reasons for it, and some of them I will present in my last part of the presentation, that the quality of democracy today is not at all worse than it was in the 60s and even 70s. I will argue it is the opposite. And as much as I like all the writing on the industrial relation by Colin Crouch, the book Post-Democracy is utterly, utterly wrong. However, let me go to some of these points. Is it true that the nexus between the representatives and the represented are going to break? Here, my argument, my diagnosis reads no. But in most mature and young democracy, the nexus has become thinner, more complex, and is in need of more care than before. As I have said, the supply side of politics has not kept pace with the increased demand side from the side of citizens. How about inclusion? One cannot talk about representation without posing an additional question about inclusion. Democracies, I argue, are the more democratic, the more they include their residents in the political representation and decision-making processes. Immigrants have to be given a fair chance to apply for citizenship and receive full political participation rates. Class. In most of the Western democracies, economic inequality has exacerbated visibly during the last 2 decades. This results, on the one hand, from a strong increase in the income of the highest 5% in society, and on the other hand, from the economic decline of the lowest third of society. Although the character of the lower classes has changed, while uneducated workers were still integrated into both society and its organization, as well in political participation during the first 3 decades after 45. In the present day, the unemployed lower classes, at least in Europe, are to an ever higher degree losing their ties to the labor market, politics, and society. They are being marginalized, and they pass on the social status to their children. The lower classes have long since turned into an underclass, which increasingly also displays ethnic traits. Politics has failed. The level of inclusion falls short of that in the 1960s. Starting from the 1960s and gaining additional momentum in the following decades, the degree of ethnic diversity has risen in almost all West European societies due to immigration. Fact is that the economic, social, and political integration of these immigrants and their offspring has, on all reasonable standards, proceeded suboptimally, to put it mildly. Immigrants and their children are disproportionately high represented among school dropouts, the unemployed, and those living on social welfare. European democracies are ethnically rather exclusive than inclusive. This reduces the quality of democracy and creates a growing group of people and citizens who are indifferent or even hostile towards Western society and democracy. At the end, after all these bad news, there are at least some good news regarding inclusion to report first from the gender front. Nowadays, women participate in elections as often as men do. Their presence in parliaments has become markedly stronger. Female ministers are exceptions no longer. Even female chancellors or prime ministers are not rarities anymore. In the Scandinavian countries, equality has been broadly established in the organs of democratic representation. Here, Germany and Switzerland still have some way to go. But nowadays, no one can dispute the fact that women are legally, politically, and even economically better off than in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And the upward development is above all also a successful outcome of democratic politics. If one were to ask a homosexual whether he or she would rather have lived in the so-called heyday of democracy in the 1960s and 70s, or today in the time of so-called post-democracy, the answer would be clear. Today in post-democracy. The legal penalization of homosexuality has been lifted, the political discrimination is past, and even societal discrimination has become, and even societal discrimination has decreased in Western Europe. Democracy has become explicitly sensitive to these minorities not following the norm of heterosexuality of society at large. And this is not little. When looking back on the track record of our democracies regarding inclusion over the past decades, a mixed performance emerges. While the efforts made in the cases of relevant minorities, as I have said with the homosexual minorities and gender equality, have proven themselves overwhelmingly successful, it is clear that inclusion based on ethnicity still leaves a lot to be desired, and that the class question has reappeared in many democracies in a new guise. One does not incidentally have to be Marxist in order to recognize that the class question also superimposes on ethnic integration. It is not the Muslim lawyer or the Turkish doctor that gets excluded. It's their fellow believers and compatriots in the lower classes who are but poorly integrated in the economy and the labor market. I come to my final comment. What does all this entail for democracy in Western Europe? Has it plunged into a crisis or not? If one takes the concept of a crisis seriously and understands it to mean a situation in which the continued existence of democracy is at stake, then most Western democracies are miles away from such a crisis of democracy. Such a notion of crisis derived from the field of medicine is not even befitting to Berlusconi's Italy. That is not to say, however, that there can be weaknesses, deficits, or even defects in particular areas. The ever more aggravated loss of trust affecting political elites, parties, and parliament cannot fully be mitigated or explained by the fact that the number of enlightened, critical citizens has risen. It seems to be much more indebted to a particular asynchrony with which advanced democracies are currently confronted. The transformation of the democratic institutions and procedures has not been able to keep up with the process of transformation going on in society. The most serious problem, however, seems to me the creeping exclusion of the growing lower classes, to begin with from the economic, then from the social, and eventually also from the political sphere of our polities. The fact that this ostracism bears the imprint of a self-reinforcing trend of generational heredity renders it not merely a social but also a political scandal. Marginalized groups are threatened by a mild form of low-intensity citizenship, such as we know it from many new democracies in Latin America or Asia. From this, however, Western Europe is nevertheless still a way off. After all, Europe is not Latin America. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang Merkel. He talks about Western Europe and its weaknesses in democracy, but a democracy which he says is miles away from an overt crisis. Who wants to ask him questions? Yes?
I would like to go back to one of your earlier points when talking about the quality of democracy, and especially the difference between Germany and Switzerland. So a couple of quick questions. So what are the indicators underlying the difference between the two countries? And the difference was small, 0.2, 0.5%. So is it in any way significant? And when you look at maybe you can go back to the slide, it also seemed that the German one, in one way or another, was going down, while the Swiss one was going up. So what are the factors kind of driving that development? And kind of surprisingly, on your chart, the two curves is coming close to each other, but then the chart is cut off at 2005. So what about the last 5 years? Just speaking of conspiracy, should be a joke. And final question, maybe more conceptually substantive, is when you talk about quality of democracy, and you were referring to nation states, so what about Europe? I mean, can we talk about the quality of German democracy or of Danish democracy, of Dutch democracy, without also taking into account the multi-level configuration with regard to, I mean, many of the points that you were making, inclusion, participation, etc., etc.?
Many questions. I certainly cannot answer all of them satisfactorily. The first question is easy, and there is no significant at all significant difference in the quality of democracy according to our 90 indicators between Germany and Switzerland. It just came out, and this was something I wanted to show because we expected Switzerland to be among the 5 or 7 leading countries together with the nice consensual democracies in Scandinavia. So, first question, of course, this is clear, not a significant difference. There is a significant difference to the leading group, as I cannot, I'm cut, yeah. So, there is of course, this was me. There's of course a difference between the leading group of 3, 4 Scandinavian countries. Here we have Denmark as the top scorer, and the 2 countries which are not that much different from the average of the 30 democracies. And we should not overestimate these changes here. There is a certain, this is Switzerland, a certain increase, and since we are going to present the whole data set in 1 month on a website, I cannot go too much into detail. By the way, I do not have all these indicators, and of course I cannot portray these 90 indicators, but I can say the way we derived them. We started with arguing there are 3 core principles of democracy: equality, political equality, freedom, and control. And out of these 3 core principles, we derived 9 core functions, such as representation, participation, inclusion, rule of law, and so forth. And then in the next step, we derived components, and at the end we had 90 indicators. So we tried to check the validity of the construct we are measuring. And I think it is now quite a solid piece, and we hope we can convince the public in a few weeks with having this for the use of all people and interested persons in the internet. What about the 5 years? You may imagine if you have 90 indicators that you do not get the most recent indicators immediately. This is a tremendous work. We did not create our own indicators, we just defined them, and then we were looking to this world of data banks, which is enormous, and checked always are these indicators reliable and are these indicators valid to our construct. And I do think they are. Europe is another thing. And I didn't want to talk about it that much because we have a presentation this morning on democracies, and I imagine this comes to the discussion as well. However, and I would follow a common critique that the European Union, if it would be a member state, would not be accepted by the Union as a member state if the member state have the same quality as the European Union. There's no doubt. However, democracy is no longer a thing which we can, what I have done here with a specific focus on the nation state, which can only be seen, so to say, from the nation state or the European Union. They are cumulative sources of legitimacy coming from the several levels, from the local, regional, national, and supranational level. However, no doubt about this is something that limits the national sovereignty of the demos. However, the demos is not that bad represented, and not by the European Parliament, I would argue, much better by the governments which are sitting in the Council of Ministers. And because I have said, and this is my last point here, if you look to the ever declining voter turnout since '79, the first direct European elections going down now to 45 and having countries like Poland, and by the way, UK as well with 23%. This is certainly something which does not show high quality of democracy.
If I may just add 2 words, where Switzerland does badly is first with participation, very low participation rate, and secondly with inclusion. We exclude, for example, 20% of our residential population who are foreigners from participating in democracy. And these are just 2 examples where others do much better. Who else? Over there.
Okay, thank you. I have a quite similar question. Do you think that the German political system will become more democratic regarding the demonstrations taking place at the moment? Or is there not also a great danger that the country is moving towards the opposite? When a German politician says, Germany is not ruled by the people but by parliaments. I mean, as we all know, there should not be a difference between people and parliaments of a country.
The media are full of these demonstrations in Stuttgart, and as we know, these are not only young people who are demonstrating on the G7 or G8 summits. These are people coming, so to say, from the core and the middle classes of the society. However, I would be extremely cautious to extrapolate this wave of demonstration as an endurable sign which endangers the quality of democracy. But something becomes visible through it. There is a growing rift between the citizens and the political elites. Me personally, even I'm not a follower of the Krise der Demokratie, by the way, I think here one has to be very careful about the legitimacy of political decisions. The line of representation and legitimacy, I think, is quite solid. There are elected representatives, they decide on this matter. There were years and years of trials at the courts, and the courts decided in favor of it. And now the arrogance of the political elites in these matters helped to create resistance and mobilize citizens against the project. But what to do now? Should politicians follow then the people on the street? Intuitively, we think they should take them into account. But would they be more representative for the decision than the elected parliament? I have very much doubts about this, very much doubts about this. Even now we know, this is probably something more problematic, even now we know there is a majority of the people who are against the whole project. But this has very much to do with the way the political elites handled this case. But then, to come back to your second question, is it the parliaments who govern and not the demos? One has to say, who is the demos here? Who should go to a referendum? The citizens of Stuttgart? Also the citizens of Heidelberg? And why not those of Berlin? They are affected as well. So who is a constituency for this kind of decision? There's one point I would follow, and this is a certain distance from the political elites and the public and the citizens, the way that they portray public procurement. If they have these infrastructural projects, systematically they present lower costs. This is true for all. It's a systematic thing which runs all through the public procurements. And if it indeed they have tricked the figures and the costs, this is something which has to be reconsidered. But it is, from a point of legitimacy, not a very open or convincing argument. Now the citizens have to decide, or the demos, in a referendum on this matter. And again, I would not extrapolate this moment as a sign that there's now an increasing mobilization and resistance. Who has seen the anti-nuclear plant or power stations, the protest against it, or the deploying of mid-range nuclear weapons in Germany was much, much bigger. It was 30 years ago. It is important, and it has to influence the agenda of the politicians, but I don't think the resolution could easily be that a referendum should decide. By the way, last point, the European Union is paying for this as well. Why should not the Greek citizens then have a say in the project as well?
I think time is up for our first speaker and the debate. We invite the second speaker, who is Stephanie Beiler. Thank you very much, Wolfgang.